20% of your work is probably producing 80% of your results, and the other 80% of your effort is close to wasted. That's not a guess. It's a pattern that shows up again and again once you know to look for it, and most managers never look. The pattern has a name, and it starts in the 1800s with an Italian economist named Vilfredo Pareto, who noticed something strange while studying land ownership in Italy. Roughly 80% of the land was owned by roughly 20% of the people. That alone would just be an odd fact about 19th century Italian property records. Forgettable. The kind of trivia that dies in a footnote. But Pareto kept noticing the same shape everywhere else he looked, in places that had nothing to do with land or wealth at all. In his own garden, he found that roughly 80% of the peas came from roughly 20% of the pea pods. Different domain entirely, same lopsided ratio. That's the moment this stops being a coincidence about one country's land records and starts looking like something closer to a genuine pattern in how outcomes distribute themselves across almost any system involving people, effort, or resources. Business researchers rediscovered the ratio decades later, applying it to areas Pareto himself never studied, and it held up with unsettling consistency. 80% of a company's revenue often comes from 20% of its customers, not spread evenly across the client list the way an org chart might imply it should be. 80% of customer complaints usually trace back to 20% of recurring issues, the same handful of root causes generating most of the noise, while dozens of other issues each contribute almost nothing to the total volume. And here's the one that should actually sting a little if you manage people. 80% of your calendar might be filled with tasks that barely move the needle on anything that actually matters. Here's the trap almost every manager falls into without realizing it, and it's worth naming precisely because it's so intuitive that it barely feels like a trap at all. Most teams treat every task on the list as roughly equally important, because equal treatment feels fair, feels responsible, feels like due diligence. So Monday gets buried under urgent emails, the ones demanding a reply simply because they showed up first and loudest. And Friday, if there's time left over, finally gets spent on the one project that actually moves the business forward. That ordering is exactly backwards. And it's backwards specifically because urgency and importance are two completely different properties of a task that happen to get confused with each other constantly. Urgent means it's demanding attention right now. Important means it actually matters for the outcome you're trying to produce. The two overlap sometimes, but not nearly as often as a full inbox makes it feel like they do. And a full inbox will always argue loudly for urgency winning the argument by default. Now, it's worth being precise about the number itself, because the exact ratio isn't actually the important part, even though it's the part that gets remembered. It's never precisely 80 and 20 in any given business. Sometimes it's 90-10, a handful of customers driving almost the entire revenue line. Sometimes it's 70-30, a somewhat wider base contributing to the outcome. The number 80-20 is a memorable shorthand, not a law of physics, and chasing the exact ratio in your own numbers is missing the point entirely. The actual pattern worth internalizing is this: a small slice of effort, or customers, or defects, or tasks usually explains most of the outcome in almost any system you care to measure, and the small slice is rarely obvious just from looking at the full list. It has to be found by actually measuring, not assumed by scanning a task list and guessing which items feel the most important. That last point matters more than it sounds like it should, because most people's intuition about which 20% matters is wrong, or at least incomplete, more often than they'd expect. The task that feels the most urgent, the one generating the most noise, the one someone keeps escalating, is very often not the task in the actual high-value 20%. It just has the loudest advocate. Real measurement, actual revenue attribution, actual defect tracing, actual time tracking against outcomes routinely surfaces a different answer than gut feeling does, and the gap between the two is usually where all the wasted effort has been hiding the entire time. This is also why the audit has to be quantitative rather than a gut check conversation in a weekly meeting. A room full of reasonable people discussing which clients or tasks matter most from memory will still tend to reward whoever's most recently vocal about their priority, the same distortion that shows up when guessing at complaint frequency. Pulling actual numbers, Actual revenue by account, actual hours by task category over a real stretch of time removes the recency and loudness bias almost entirely because a spreadsheet doesn't remember who yelled the loudest last Tuesday. It just shows what actually happened. Think about the complaint example for a second, because it's a good illustration of how the gap between intuition and measurement actually works in practice. If you asked most managers to guess which issue generates the most complaints, they'd usually point to whichever one happened most recently, or whichever one was loudest and most memorable: the customer who called and yelled, the email with 5 exclamation points. But loud and frequent aren't the same thing. A single dramatic complaint sticks in memory far longer than 20 quiet, recurring ones that never escalate but happen constantly in the background. Only an actual tally, a real count of what's coming in and why, over enough time to smooth out the noise of any single dramatic incident, tells you which 20% of root causes is actually generating 80% of the volume. Memory is a bad substitute for a log, and most managers are running on memory. So why does this pattern show up so consistently across such wildly different domains? Land ownership, garden peas, customer revenue, recurring complaints? The underlying mechanism is what's sometimes called a compounding advantage or preferential attachment, and once you see it, it explains a lot more than just business metrics. In most real systems, an early or slightly larger advantage doesn't just persist, it compounds. A plant that happens to get slightly better sunlight or slightly better soil produces slightly more pods, which means it draws slightly more of the gardener's attention and water, which produces even more pods the following season. A customer who buys more from you gets more attention, better service, a stronger relationship, which makes them more likely to buy even more. Small early differences don't stay small. They snowball, because the systems we operate in aren't fair in the sense of evenly distributing opportunity. They're compounding in the sense that advantage tends to attract more advantage over time. That compounding is exactly what produces the lopsided, unequal distribution Pareto kept noticing everywhere he looked, whether he was studying farmland or vegetables. It's also why trying to force an even, fair distribution of attention across every customer, every task, or every plant in the garden tends to backfire, because it works against the natural direction the system wants to move in. Spreading a gardener's limited water and attention perfectly evenly across every single plant sounds fair, but it starves the handful of plants that would have produced the most pods if they'd gotten a proportionate share of the resources, while barely helping the weaker plants catch up at all. Equal treatment and effective treatment are not the same goal, and confusing them is a large part of why so many teams end up with calendars that feel busy and fair on paper, while producing results that lag far behind the effort going in. Here's the part most managers miss entirely, and it's the part that turns this from an interesting observation into something worth actually restructuring your week around. Knowing the 80-20 pattern exists, intellectually doesn't change anything on its own. Plenty of managers have heard of the Pareto Principle, nod along when it comes up, and then go right back to running their calendar exactly the same way the next morning. Urgent email first, important project last, if there's time. The pattern only does anything useful once it gets turned into an actual audit, a recurring, deliberate look at which 20% is really producing the results, instead of an interesting fact you already knew and filed away. Smart managers build that audit into a regular habit, checking their team's time against real results on a set schedule, not just when something's already gone wrong and everyone's scrambling to explain why. The questions worth asking aren't complicated. They just rarely get asked out loud in most organizations. Which clients are actually driving growth versus which ones simply generate the most contact and the most meetings without contributing much to the bottom line? Which products or services are carrying the business versus which ones exist mostly out of habit because someone built them years ago and nobody's ever formally decided to retire them? Which recurring tasks on the team's plate actually move an outcome forward versus which ones just eat hours because they've always been done, inherited from a process nobody currently on the team actually designed? There's a useful analogy here from outside the office entirely, which is how a good editor treats a long manuscript. A first draft usually has a handful of chapters doing most of the emotional and structural work, the ones a reader actually remembers afterward. and a much larger number of chapters that exist mostly to connect those key moments together. A weak editor treats every chapter as equally precious and polishes all of them the same amount, spreading effort evenly across pages that don't equally deserve it. A good editor identifies the load-bearing chapters early, protects and strengthens those first, and only spends remaining time on the connective tissue once the parts that actually matter are as strong as they can be. Running a team's week is the same exercise, applied to hours instead of pages, and most managers are still the weak editor, giving every task on the list roughly equal polish, regardless of how much weight it's actually carrying. Once those questions get honest answers, the next move is simple to describe and genuinely uncomfortable to execute. Cut or delegate the long tail, the large share of activity that consumes a disproportionate amount of time while contributing very little to the outcome that actually matters. This is uncomfortable specifically because most of that long tail doesn't feel wasteful while you're doing it. Answering emails feels productive. Attending a recurring meeting feels responsible. Servicing a small, high-maintenance client feels like good customer relations. None of it feels like waste from inside the task itself. It only reveals itself as waste when you step back and measure it against the 20% that's actually carrying the outcome, and that stepping back is exactly the part most people never build time for, because the urgent stuff is always right there in front of them, demanding to be handled first. It's also worth being honest about why cutting the long tail is harder in practice than it sounds in a meeting where everyone agrees the idea makes sense. Every item in that long tail usually has an owner, someone who built it, maintains it, or has a relationship attached to it. And cutting it means having a specific, sometimes awkward conversation with a specific person rather than making an abstract policy decision from a spreadsheet. The 40-account client list didn't get built by one bad decision. It got built by dozens of individually reasonable decisions, saying yes to a new account, keeping a legacy client out of loyalty, agreeing to service one more small request because saying no felt disproportionate in the moment. Untangling that takes more courage than building it did, because each cut has a name and a history attached to it, and it's much easier to keep adding to a list than to go back through it and remove things that already exist. That asymmetry, easy to add, hard to remove, is part of why so many teams accumulate a long tail in the first place, and rarely trim it back down, even after everyone privately agrees it's grown too large. This week is a reasonable place to actually start, rather than treating this as something to think about eventually. Look hard, specifically, at your team's actual task list, not the idealized version of it in a job description, the real one, the one reflected in calendars and completed tickets over the last month. Find the handful of items that clearly, measurably move results, the ones you could point to and say, with real evidence behind it, this is what's driving the number we care about. Protect those hours first, deliberately, on the calendar, before anything else gets scheduled into the week, and let everything else wait its turn behind that protected block instead of quietly displacing it the way urgent tasks always do when they're allowed to go first by default. One manager who actually did this, rather than just nodding along with the concept, cut her team's client list from 40 accounts down to 12 after actually measuring which accounts were driving revenue and which were just consuming hours without much to show for it. That's a brutal-sounding cut on paper, more than 2/3 of the client list gone. But revenue barely moved, because the 12 remaining accounts had been doing most of the real work the entire time, and the other 28 had mostly been generating activity, not results. Meanwhile, stress dropped fast, because a huge amount of scattered reactive effort simply disappeared from the team's week, freeing up hours that used to go toward relationships that were never going to produce much, no matter how well they were serviced. Here's my own take on why this particular idea is so widely known and so rarely actually applied inside real teams. The 80-20 rule is easy to nod, along with as a piece of trivia and genuinely hard to act on, because acting on it means admitting that a lot of what currently fills your calendar and a lot of what fills your team's calendar isn't actually earning the time it takes up. That's a harder thing to sit with than the interesting historical fact about pea pods, and it's exactly why most people quote the rule at dinner parties instead of running the audit at work. 20% of your work is probably producing 80% of your results. And until you actually go measure which 20% that is, you're spending most of your week protecting the wrong things by default, simply because they showed up first and loudest. If breakdowns like this help you run a tighter team, go ahead and subscribe. Expect a fresh one weekly.